I'm David Grenke. I'm the chair of theater and dance at UC Davis, and my particular area of research is dance and choreography. So France has a long history of being the cultural center of the universe. Like any cultural narrative, that can be debated, or there's a lot of layers to it. But France has always arguably been about the exploration of art and culture. And if we look at the beginnings of ballet, and especially experimental ballet at the Ballet Russe and Diaghilev, and the folks that were running it, Massine, they've always been a part of dance, and I think always been a discoverer of cultural practices outside of their own. We always like to say in the dance, certainly in the American dance scene, the French are very much known for the national treasures of this country, Paul Taylor, Martha Graham, Merce Cunningham. They were supported and made their way primarily overseas, and in particular in France, and that's really where they were supported. And then they kind of came back and were embraced by their own country. It's interesting, around the time of World War II, so different countries reacted to the arts, and in particular dance, in different ways. So post-World War II, I think the US, for the most part, their perspective in terms of being an ambassador of culture, putting culture out there. So there were state-sponsored tours that allowed us to tour. And that was really effective, but it's interesting, if you look at that, it was more about kind of putting a different face of the US on the global stage. So it painted this other side of us. During the student worker revolt in 1968, I think it was, in France, it was interesting. There was kind of, there was the counterculture in that period of time globally. And the way it manifested with the student uprising in France was that, the French hadn't kept up with times on a lot of levels. And what that led to, you have Jacques Chirac there, and Michel Guy, who was the cultural minister. Instead of, using funds, and there was a huge cultural budget at that time, but instead of using the funds to support tours going out, what they did is they decentralized it, and they put money into the regions so that local communities had incentive to do dance festivals and cultural festivals, both to support their own artists, but really as an exchange to bring in other cultures. So these festivals popped up everywhere in France, in every town. And that really led to a cultural exchange, specifically for dance, because dance at that time, in terms of modern dance or contemporary dance, wasn't as prevalent, perhaps, in France as it was in some other countries. And I think you have to look at the identity with a national ballet company, and that, on some levels, was an inhibitor of experimentation and exploration, perhaps. And I think that cultural exchange, the idea of bringing in a cross-pollination to allow artists to dialogue and talk and be influenced by one another, is quintessentially the French. As an example, the first, out of that outgrowth came the first theaters that were dedicated solely to dance were in France. And I think Angeline Préjolcage, their home now is a cultural center that has moved to the next level, which is not only do dance companies perform there, but it is a house for the development of dance. For every stage of the work gets done on site there, and that's an extraordinary, investment. That's an extraordinary valuing of dance, what it is as an art form, and kind of taking responsibility and ownership for it as a part of the culture. And that's certainly something we look to. Well, so it's interesting, again, out of that cultural exchange that is happening in the 60s in these regions, it lays the groundwork for companies and voices, quite honestly, that are contemporary work that had the ability to look outside of a vernacular they were very accustomed to or very familiar with and start asking questions. And you do look at the regional players there and how they really are growing roots. I mean, if we're going to be honest about it, when Martha Graham toured, the French weren't that wild about Martha Graham and her first tour in '54. So contemporary dance, modern dance in particular, had a tough time. I mean, there were things to overcome. And again, I think a lot of that has to do with a very deeply ensconced history around dance as a national identity based on a ballet company. I think the French did navigate that. However, they always embraced, they embraced Wigmont, they embraced Loie Fuller and Duncan. So it wasn't a question of them not having a taste for modern dance. They have always been very involved in the conversation, let's put it that way. Whenever I've toured there with any company, I remember it was eye-opening to be there on stage and have half the audience bravoing and half booing. And once I got over the discomfort of that, I remember really enjoying the fact that, the history of dance in particular in France it is a dialogue and you are invested and you have an opinion about it. And I think that is far better for the life of the art form than, spending your 2 hours and then going out to dinner and, it's like watching television. So it's interesting thinking about the relationship of narratives and folk tales in ballet, and they've always existed. But I think the real question that is always a point of examination in choreography is narrative versus non-narrative, and there are a million different slicings of that question. It's not as simple as something that tells a story and something that doesn't. Dance in and of itself is impressionistic, so it's telling stories in a particular kind of way. I think certainly when I look at Ballet Projecage and Angeline's background in both ballet vernacular and certainly influenced by Cunningham, it really sheds a lot of light on that question of narrative versus non-narrative and the role of the audience when we look at Cunningham's work. And ultimately there was that distancing from a concern for narrative, because at the end of the day, you don't really have any control over how an audience is going to view it. And so you should engage with what do things do when we put them in proximity. And so there are different incarnations of that. When I look at Balanchine's narrative works or story ballets, they're very decidedly still abstractions of a thing and they gesture toward. And I certainly see that in Angeline Préjolacage, his work in narrative. He has a good body of work that deals with either reconstructions of narrative works, classic narrative works, or folk tales. There's a language that he uses in the program notes around the question of representation. And I find that interesting how he's using that, and I actually have more questions about when he's using the word representation, what are his concerns? When we think of representation in terms of someone like Ruth St. Denis, representation has a kind of negative connotation because she's essentially, on some levels, co-opting cultural, iconic imagery that are simply based on her own perspective of what they may look like, and embodying a thing that isn't based in any kind of anthropology or any familiarity with cultural practices, it's ultimately somewhat of cultural appropriation. But then you look at the next generation after that, of her disciples and Graham, that are really pushing against that and saying there needs to be a deeper exploration of that. Languages that come from the body come from all kinds of things that influence them, and they come from cultural practices, and they are dialectical in a kind of way. So I find that the territory that Angeline is exploring and doubling back to narratives, but still staying really in the compositional truth of that question, which is how much of it is about telling or transcribing a story, and how much is it providing the space where it's staying true to the compositional question of allowing the viewer to come in, putting things in proximity, and seeing what they tell, and then still borrowing from a jumping off point that exists in a folklore or a cultural history that is narratives that exist in different cultures. So I find it an interesting and ongoing question about representation and looking at cultural practices.